Is there a story like Ruth in the Bible? When we think of all the implications, all the knock-ons that happen because of one person's loyalty and love and submission, kindness, all the knock-ons that there are in the Bible. It's amazing, really, that we don't celebrate the story of Ruth more. This is what I understand, and please read the whole book. It's 4 chapters. It's squeezed between the book of Judges, which ends with these words: "There was no king in Israel at this time, and each person did what was right in their own eyes." Is that a sign of wildness? You know, this is after the people had come back from Egypt, through the desert, heard the law of God, built the tabernacle of God. They had the Ark of the Covenant, they had the priesthood, the law, everything. And yet, they did what was right in their own eyes. So that's the end of Judges. And somewhere in between that and 1 Samuel, which begins with a husband who can't solve his wife's deepest grief, that she can't give birth to a child. That child whom God grants to Hannah in consolation for her desperate prayer, that child becomes Samuel, who then anoints King David, a king, you see, to rule the people. And no longer will the Israelite people have the excuse to just do what is right in their own eyes. So between Judges and Samuel, Ruth. There was a man in the days of the Judges named Elimelech. And because of a famine, he had chosen to take his family, take Naomi, his wife, and his 2 sons, and travel to the land of Moab. We need to stop there. We need to pause for a moment. Elimelech was protecting his family. There's nothing wrong with that. He was an economic migrant. He was presumably worried that famine would ruin his family or even threaten their lives. And so off he went to the desert. And he became a sojourner in the land of Moab. In other words, he went back to his tent and became a nomadic pasture farmer. That's what we're to understand from that. Of course, Moses spent time in Moab, as we know. But essentially, he'd gone back. God had given the people an inheritance in the land of Israel, and Elimelech had turned his back on it. Now, there's no judgment of Elimelech in the text. This is what he did, and this is what happened. His 2 sons grew up. They married local women. Elimelech died, and then the 2 sons also died. And this brings up a big theme in the Bible, and it's a theme in your life and my life. Have you ever said to yourself, I just want to settle down? Or have you ever heard somebody say, well, I'm not really ready to settle down? The Bible promises settling down to people who follow God. To the Israelites, they had been sojourners. They'd been temporary in the land of Egypt. And then God himself had sojourned with the people. That means that he'd lived with them in a tent. And as he moved, they moved. And he poured out his commands. He answered their prayers. He was in the place of judgment. But in temporary structures. And his promise to his people was settlement, from sojourn to settlement, from restlessness to rest. And that is the promise for God's people. It's his promise to you and me today. Rest. In Hebrews, we're reminded that we're not to consider God's rest as being something undesirable or to be taken for granted. We're to press through, we're to follow through, we're to struggle, and we're to fight, and we're to put one foot in front of the other, and we're to do it together. We're to please God in this life. But this life comes to an end, and we are offered rest, from sojourn to settlement. And Elimelech had done the opposite. He'd gone from settlement to sojourn. And there this sad moment happened, where both Elimelech and his 2 sons died. And again, there's no judgment. Yet we have a sense of all that Naomi loses. Now, it's said, isn't it? No mother should bury her own children. It just seems so awful when somebody dies, in a sense, out of time. And so Naomi has every reason to feel utterly bereft, miserable. And Naomi has, in effect, she's been part of turning her back on the settlement that God has for them, on the inheritance that God has back in the land of Israel, in Bethlehem, actually. Surprise, surprise. It seems that she's lost her right to her land in Bethlehem. I wonder if we really understand that today. Most of our lives are lived in sort of 1 or 2 generations, aren't they? And although people live longer and longer, we don't have a sense that we're as solid or settled in one place as we used to be. There was a study a few years ago that suggested that people in the United States made significant moves 5 times in their lives. Well, Lindsay and I, we've made more moves than that. But at the end of all the travelling, there's a promise of settlement, and to a Christian, an inheritance which is for all time. But to the Jewish people, the settlement, this inheritance, was something that they needed to keep. They needed to keep hold of. They needed to keep it warm. And it was into perpetuity. In other words, keep the land in the family. You know, we've all seen that scene from Gone with the Wind, haven't we? Where Scarlett O'Hara's father tells her, "Oh, Scarlett, the land, it's the only thing that matters." I'm not quoting it well, by the way, and my accent is terrible. But it's the only thing that lasts. Naomi's lost her husband. She's lost her children, her sons, and she's lost her inheritance. No wonder then that Naomi, the first character, if you like, in this story, Naomi is bereft. Now, the name Naomi means gift or grace or something that is of God's kindness. And it becomes a bitter irony to Naomi, and she says, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. Call me bitter, because God has dealt bitterly with me. I knew a man who, in ministry to others, found one day that he was talking to a person whom he described as having given herself permission to be miserable. And I think that there are times where in our struggle with our situation, we're so down, so upset, so sad, that we stop seeing the greatness of God and the mercy of God and the grace of God. And Naomi could, in a sense, be forgiven, couldn't she, for saying, just call me bitterness, because God has dealt bitterly with me. Again, I'm reminded that the Bible never allows us to think that everything is always just great for everybody. There are plenty of times where the weeping and the lamentation of the people is so loud in our ears that sometimes we just want to say, oh, please don't. just give us a break. But Naomi's life had turned bitter on her, hadn't it? And she changed her name by default. She said, I'm not Naomi anymore, I'm bitter. But one thing had its glimmer of hope for Naomi. And remember, even in the worst times, the terrible times, the hard times, the muddy times, the times when the weather is so foul that we can't see the way forward, often there is just the merest glimpse, a blade of grass through the snow, a robin crying in the tree. There is something, a sign that God is still in business and still in control, and he is still gracious. And it's this. We read in verse 6 of chapter 1. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she'd heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. A simple mercy. Remember, Jesus told his disciples to ask God to provide daily bread. And this was the sign, wasn't it, of God's goodness to his people, that daily, apart from the Sabbath, daily they would find this manna falling on the ground, and they'd eat. God's mercy on his people was to give them their daily bread, and he had revisited the country that Naomi had left. He'd revisited it, and he had provided what they needed to eat, rain and then crops and so on. And don't you think that in all of this COVID time, there are still signs of God's goodness to us? There were signs that people would pull together. There were signs that people would commit acts of kindness and generosity to one another, that people would appreciate those who put themselves out for the health of others in sacrificial ways, and still suffering, some of those people, from the effects of treating COVID. And then a vaccine, a way that we can see forward into the future. Now, Naomi didn't know what she was going to. She just knew she needed food, and that God had provided. God continues to provide. He continues to provide for our nations. He continues to provide the seasons that we need. He continues to provide what we need to live. Now, yes, human wastefulness and human evil is so terrible and everything, but don't forget, in the middle of that despite it all, God's grace is to be seen day by day, in the blade of grass, in the song of a robin, in the provision of safety out of this COVID threat. Because God never gave up on the nations. He never gave up on his world. He never gave up on his promise. And so Naomi, in her bitterness, in her sadness, in her sorrow, she does recognize that God is at work. And we should give her some credit for that. Let's move to the next person, Ruth. What an extraordinary character Ruth is, given the choice of going back home to her family. And remember, for a woman to return to her family, there was a bit of shame and a bit of, unpleasantness about that. But her husband had died, and there was nothing guaranteed for her in the land of Israel. And so it would have been natural to seek her own people, her own language, her own religion, and to put herself on their mercy. But no, this is what she says. Don't urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. She goes actually from settlement to sojourning, doesn't she? From rest to a nomad lifestyle, which she's probably had anyway. So maybe I'm making too much. Forgive that one. She'll even be buried where Naomi or Mara is buried. What a remarkable promise to make to somebody. Now look, on the journey of life, we need people like Ruth to go with us. We need that loyalty, don't we? The Bible rates loyalty very highly. There is a time when Jonathan, the son of Saul, is about to go into a foolhardy attack on an enemy outpost. And he turns to his armor bearer and he says to him, well, what shall we do? And the armor bearer says to him, do what is in your mind. I am with you, heart and soul. He is 100% with Jonathan. Oh, how much we need that loyalty, don't we, as people? What a consolation it is to us when we find that we're in companionship with people who are equal to a task which is either difficult or foolhardy. There is a moment where, looking back, I can remember crazy Christians, people who said, I think I'll try this, or I think I'll try that, and everything was against them. But what made the difference was someone loyal and supportive and energetic and positive. Now, look, we've got that in our power as Christians. We have those characteristics in our power to do. And you are going to look at the world outside and you're going to say, I don't know what we can do to bring about blessing and goodness and peace and good news, to bless those who are in need of blessing, to feed those who are hungry, to bring good news to those who are enslaved by anxiety. But when a person stands up and says, in faith, I don't know how to do it, but God is doing a work here and I'm going to follow it, when they receive companionship from another, it is a beautiful thing. And Ruth walks with Mara into her new life. The consolation of that loyalty is beyond price. And then Ruth proves herself many times over. She deports herself well. She doesn't go and say, oh, in my country it was a lot better. No, she follows the rules and she works hard. And she works selflessly. She works for Naomi. She goes into the fields and she follows around all the harvesters. She picks up the gleanings and the bits and pieces of wheat or barley that are being cut and harvested and gathered. She finds just what is left out of all of that. And she takes it back to Naomi. She looks after Naomi. And there is consolation in that care, isn't there? And that care is a Christian characteristic, and it is at our disposal. Paul rated that partnership so highly. We've been looking at the book of Philippians before Christmas, but to think of the one theme that comes out, it's partnership in the gospel. And Ruth throws herself in like the armor bearer, heart and soul, and she works hard. She works very hard. She's tired at the end of the day. And she listens to Naomi as well. She doesn't disregard her. She doesn't say, well, you're a widow and you don't know what you're talking about. She treats her with respect and with great love. How beautiful that is as well. And how significant. Because her deportment, her character, the beauty of her actions, and presumably her good looks, bring her to the attention of Boaz. And Boaz is the third person in our story. And Boaz, watching Ruth at work, instructs his farmhands to leave a bit of extra, just drop some bits and pieces around. And he is generous in the way that he deals with Ruth. And he falls in love with her. And there is that strange moment where she goes to Naomi. Naomi says, well, Boaz is in my family. And so if you go and you lie at his feet at night and declare yourself to him, he might offer marriage to you. She has this sort of system off pat, and sure enough, Boaz, because he's an honourable man and because he's been protective of Ruth, and he's not allowed his men to say, here's someone who's, in a way that the opportunity for slavery and victimization and abuse, they're just there. They're rife in this story, and yet Boaz is protective. And I think that is a good Christian characteristic as well, isn't it? Someone who's protective and supportive and generous, and he honours God's law. And so Boaz acts honourably towards Ruth, and of course we get this great moment where Boaz says to his cousin or his kinsman redeemer, right, do you want this land? Remember, that's the land that Naomi and Elimelech have left behind. In one sense, maybe not exactly that land, but in effect it is. And Boaz says to the kinsman redeemer, the redeemer will buy it back, and then it'll go into his name. And Boaz says, you have the first shout on this. This is the honourable thing to do. And of course, the kinsman redeemer says, I'll have the land, but I'll not take the lady. And Boaz says, well, the land comes with the lady. She comes with the land. Because it's a promise of God that his his inheritance will continue to these generations of people. And so he says, well, if you won't, then I will. It's a wonderful moment. Ruth with all of this steeliness and this love and this loyalty, and Boaz with his honor and his generosity. It seems like a true love story, doesn't it? And the comfort is that they get married and they have a boy child. And that last scene is Naomi cradling, nursing the boy child that Ruth and Boaz have had together. Ruth, a foreigner. Ruth, not an Israelite. Ruth, a woman. Ruth, a person not earmarked for a permanent inheritance. Mother to the child who'll give birth to a child who'll give birth to King David. Ruth's story is incredibly powerful today. We have the background of a national disaster. We have the immediacy of personal misery and personal disaster. We have good deeds done just in the name of doing the right thing. And we have honor. And all of these combine to bring blessing and to bring something permanent and to bring rest out of sojourning or to bring goodness out of chaos. But there's more, because God has been orchestrating all of this, and there is no doubt that God has used these circumstances, that he has placed the right people. All of the coincidental structures in the story tell me that the story was written by an author who had an even better end than the happiness and the safety and the peace and the protection of one family. Because in that son who was born at the end is Jesse. And out of the root of Jesse, the prophets will tell. And from the city of Bethlehem, the town of Bethlehem, will come one who will save the people and bring redemption on a huge scale. And it's Jesus, born of the line of Boaz. Of David. But that's Boaz. And it is not trite to say that if you are struggling with a personal circumstance which is difficult for you to face today, that there is consolation in Jesus Christ. It's not trite to say that if you're feeling alone and you don't know what's happening in life and you're struggling to see a future and a hope, that there is redemption in Jesus Christ. And if you're feeling lonely, there is companionship in Jesus Christ. And if there's a lack of justice, there is justice in Jesus Christ. Because God so loved the whole world that he sent his only Son, that we might not perish but have eternal life. That you and me, we can go from sojourning to rest, to settlement, to peace, and an inheritance which is eternal. And so the story of Ruth tells us that God cares about you, and he cares about me. He cares about us so much that even in our worst times, he is able to provide companionship and consolation for us. And that is true. But beyond this, he's able to provide an inheritance which has no end. Are you going to change your name? Will you choose Naomi, or will you choose Mara? May God give each one of us wisdom and faith and the ability to console and to be companions to one another, to bring sympathy and small acts of righteousness, small acts of generosity, which might just change our world. Amen.